I invite you to stand as we hear our text read from the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 13. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all of my possessions, and I hand over my body so that I might boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we only know in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
These words from 1 Corinthians 13 are so familiar. I imagine that every one of us has heard these read in a wedding service at some point in our lives. Can I get a show of hands? How many of y'all have heard these read at weddings? It's one of the most popular biblical texts that folks choose to read when they're getting married. But when lifted out of the context of the book of 1 Corinthians, it makes a lot of sense that these would be the go-to verses for couples to include as they make vows to each other. It's an extensive list that reminds us of the behaviors and attitudes that nurture and foster love, as well as those things that damage and hinder it. But taking these verses out of that larger context of Corinthians just gives us a picture of love in the abstract. It's separated from the concrete circumstances and realities that elicited these specific descriptions of what love is and what it isn't, what love does and what it doesn't do. When Paul wrote these words, he wasn't focusing his attention on people who were about to tie the knot. Instead, he was talking to the entire community of Corinth. Paul had been hearing about issues within the community that were causing division and disagreement among the people. And what he was hearing about their behavior started to concern him. You might remember that earlier in his letter to the Corinthians, Paul named the confusion that they were experiencing about who they were following and how they were dividing themselves into different factions. Some people claimed that they belonged to Apollo, some to Paul, some to Cephas. Others claimed that they belonged to Christ. And Paul wanted to draw them all back to the center, to their identity in Christ. And in the previous chapter, 12 of 1 Corinthians, Paul speaks about the body of Christ, about how the ears and the eyes and the hands and the feet all have their specific role in the body. And not one part is more important than another part. All the parts are needed to work together and complement each other. But we too know and have seen how life in community can get out of balance really quickly. When some people or gifts are elevated above others as being more important or more valuable in the gifts that they offer. In our text for tonight, one of the things that Paul was addressing was the spirit with which people were exercising their faith. Even if a person or community is gifted with the ability to speak in tongues or to prophesy or to understand deep mysteries or to possess great knowledge, if those are used to elevate themselves and to make them feel better than others, they become empty and lose their power and meaning. And specifically, Paul states that when these gifts are practiced without love, they become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. So what Paul's communicating to the Corinthians is not that abstract picture of love. He's talking about the kind of love that requires really hard work. His words address those specific practices that were present in the community. Common practices that I'm guessing the people of Corinth took a lot of pride in, that they pointed to when they were asked about their community and who they were. But when their gifts were practiced without the love that Paul spoke of, something very important was missing. And Paul offered them a very simple explanation for what love is. Love is patient, love is kind, love never ends. Love is infinite. When we talk about love in this way, it makes me feel overwhelmed in the same kind of way when I try to figure out just the magnitude of this universe. And I can't wrap my head around all of it. Considering how big it is and how this love will come, that it has come before us and will be here long after all of us are no longer here. Paul's description of love echoes the words of Jesus that he spoke to his disciples in the Gospel of John when Jesus invited them into that ultimate source of love from which he had been born, the unending love of God, and he instructed them to abide in it, to plant themselves in this love that would not let them go, to live their lives in this love that would not fade or be lost. It's a powerful, active, persistent force in the world that Paul is calling the people of Corinth toward. And at its core, we know that love is patient and kind, but those are two things that don't always come so easily to us, both personally and communally. It can be a little easier to see and understand Paul's claims about love when we think about it on an individual level. I know how easy it is to get into habits and patterns that embody what Paul says love is not, or what love does not do. How much time and energy do we exert protecting ourselves and our egos with behaviors and ways of being in this world in relationship with each other that actually nurture envy and arrogance, rudeness, irritability, and resentment, rather than nurturing this infinite love that Paul calls us toward? I don't know about you, but I think this probably happens daily for me, whether I realize it or not, and it comes in so many different forms. It might be frustration with a person who continues to ask us for something that we absolutely can't offer or give them, and our patience wears really thin. Or it might be irritation at our children or our parents for not seeing our way of thinking or agreeing with us on a matter that is of utmost importance to us. Or maybe it's envy that we feel toward a coworker, a teammate, or a classmate who does something better or with more ease than we are able to do. Or maybe it's rudeness returned for rudeness, in line at a store or backed up in traffic, with absolutely zero knowledge of why the other person is in such a rush to get ahead or speed by us. And maybe it's resentment at work when we don't receive recognition or acknowledgement that we think we deserve, that someone else gets when someone else gets the promotion that we might assume belonged to us. But when we live out of that resentment and rudeness and envy and arrogance, that infinite source of love becomes hidden and obscured. We lose sight of it. But Paul reminds us that it's always still there. It's always operating in the background, whether we see it or acknowledge it or not. We can still find our way to it. But we have to be ready and willing to do the work to get to it and to uncover it. That's right, Zeke. Amen. But we can lose sight of communal love as well. At times, we find ourselves in those spaces where we might be asked to abide by policies and procedures that are not of our own making or choosing, that might be grounded in values and principles that are based on standards other than or in addition to love. I often find myself being in the position of a gatekeeper of sorts in my work at the hospital. I'm often the front line of communication between the staff in the emergency room and families who are arriving at the hospital to be with someone who's about to be admitted. And more often than not, those of us who serve as chaplains are entering into the most unimaginable moments of terror and just awfulness in people's lives that they don't expect when they wake up that morning. And so I often find myself having to enforce rules and policies that I would like to bend a little bit or, go around the edge of, but I can't. And sometimes that feels like what I'm doing is filled with anything but love. But those rules and policies are there to protect patients and staff and to limit liability and a whole bunch of other reasons that I could name off. But I often have to tell family members that they have to wait to see their loved one. Sometimes I have to tell them they can't see them at all. And recently I had to tell a person the latter, that they wouldn't be able to see the person that they had rushed to the hospital to be with. Understandably, they were very angry. I started yelling and pacing, and security showed up within seconds. And I asked security to give me just a minute. So I started pacing with them. There weren't a lot of words exchanged. We just walked back and forth in silence. And eventually, after a few minutes, I was able to say to them, I want more than anything to get you back there to see your family member, but I can't do that right now. The fact that I can't take you back there feels terrible to me, and I can't even imagine how much worse it feels to you. But one piece of advice that I'm going to give you right now, and you can take it or leave it, is I want you to keep working on calming yourself down, because if you keep yelling and throwing things around, even if it is okay at some point for you to go back, they might not allow you to do so. All the while, security was lingering behind us, waiting and watching. And the person who had been upset just moments before turned to me in tears and said, will you just take them a message and pray with them for me? And I did, and for that fleeting moment, it was enough. But there are other times when it's not enough. There are times when I can't take families back to the emergency room for very good reasons. And there are also times that I make the wrong assumption, say the wrong thing, or fumble around and become the gatekeeper who becomes one of the many stumbling blocks in a system that keeps someone outside the doors that they so long to go through. One day in particular stands out when I made a wrong assumption about someone in a situation that was in front of me that kept someone outside those doors. And after their family member was discharged, I passed them in the hallway, and they looked at me and said, I know you were just trying to do your job. And they turned and walked away. As chaplains, we can only describe what happens in our presence. There's no billing code for patience or kindness. There's no billing code for being arrogant or irritable in either direction. For when I get things right or when I say the wrong thing, all I can do is bear witness to what's happening and do the best I can to respond in love and describe what happens in those exchanges with the patients and their families. And I find some comfort and encouragement in these words from Paul that remind me that even when I'm caught up in systems that operate out of the values that may be a little bit different from my own, that I can still practice that patience and kindness in a spirit of love as best I can. And I find comfort in the fact that even when I get it wrong, that infinite love abides all around me, and it doesn't depend on me. It's there, it's present, it's pervasive. It holds us and sustains us. There was a moment when we were at the winter youth retreat that I observed with our youth that I wanted to share. We had gotten there earlier than some of the groups because a lot of the other groups were traveling from a further distance. And you might remember that our four guys, Lucas and Isaac and Ethan and Aiden, one year when we were at BYC, were sort of taken under the wings of these older youth from Glendale in Nashville. And they were just shown tremendous kindness, right, Aiden? And they still are in touch with these guys who are in college. And so as we had arrived early, there were other groups coming in, and there were two younger kids who were in 6th grade who came into the room where our group was playing pool. And I watched our group just fold in around them and invite them into what they were doing. And those two kids basically became a part of our youth group for the rest of the weekend. They came to our time at night because their youth group wasn't doing anything. And so it was just a beautiful reminder of the ways in which when we receive that kind of love, that then in turn we become prepared to offer it in ways that sometimes we don't even realize that we were doing it. I'm not sure that they did when I reflected that back to them and said, I see in you what you all experienced in Danny and Jacob and Paul several years ago. So yesterday, the church council met for a few hours, and those who were rotating off from 2018 and those new council members who were coming in 2019. And Mayhan guided us through a process of reflection on our mission statement. And if you need a little reminder, we focused on the first part of that. We believe that doing justice and loving mercy are intimately tied to walking humbly with God. And as I've been thinking about this text from 1 Corinthians this week and our reflections yesterday on this first part of our mission statement, I believe that these verses are a backdrop as an additional guide for us in our life together as a community. I think they've already served as a guide for us along the way, whether it's been explicit or not. We've not always gotten things right. And we talked about some of those experiences of pain and grief that we've experienced along the way as a community, as well as those places that we celebrate having done things well. But we kept coming right back around to doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God, recognizing that the justice and mercy can't be separated and are so intimately tied to that walk humbly with God. In the final verses of 1 Corinthians, Paul talks about how our specific gifts may come to an end, but that this love he describes and mirrors the love that Jesus lived and taught about, this deep and abiding love surrounds us and is so pervasive. He points out that we don't always see so clearly when we're living in the middle of things. But part of practicing this love that he speaks of is recognizing that we rarely ever have the full picture, and keeping that in mind as we walk through our days, both individually and as a community. We may think we know and understand everything, but the reality is we don't have the whole story. I learn over and over again as I meet people in some of the worst moments of their lives. And I learn it over and over again as I try to support my child as she navigates friendships and relationships as a 10-year-old. And we learn this over and over again as we walk together in this community. We only see a part of the story, one small piece that's in front of us. But we do the best we can in each moment to abide in that infinite love that sustains us. Walking humbly requires us to constantly admit what we actually don't know, to name when we've messed up, to seek to be reconciled when we've caused harm, to recognize that love precedes and will outlive us. We swim in the grace and mercy of the love of God, as Nancy so beautifully showed in her children's story with the kids. There's not anything or anyone that can ever make that untrue, that we swim and are surrounded by the love and mercy of God. Love is the most dependable and the most true thing that we can know and experience and share with each other. And for right now, that actually feels like enough. Amen.
Amen.